Good afternoon, my name is Leif Barry and I work here at the Phoenix Park Visitor Centre. Today, as part of our lunchtime talks for the Biodiversity Festival, I'm delighted to introduce Professor Jane Stout. She's a professor in Botany, School of Natural Sciences in Trinity College, Dublin, for her talk on the buzz about bees, their importance, health and conservation. Jane is an internationally renowned expert on pollinator and pollination ecology and a prominent voice for biodiversity and its value. Jane co-led the development of the All-Ireland Pollinator Plan. Jane was the project team leader for the biodiversity audit of Áras an Uachtaráin, completed in 2020 and commissioned by the OPW at the request of Uachtaráin na Éireann, Mícheál O'Higgin. For a full list of Biodiversity Festival program, please visit our website www.phoenixpark.ie. Without further ado, I will hand you over to Jane for her inspiring talk. Gora Mahagat.
Hi, I'm Jane Stout. I'm a professor in botany at Trinity College, Dublin, and I'd like to talk to you today about the buzz about bees, their importance, health and conservation. Now, when we think about bees, a lot of people think about bees in terms of honeybees, so kept by beekeepers producing honey, or some people think about them as annoying pests that sting people. But bees are a huge and really diverse group of insects. There's 20,000 different species of bee worldwide. Compare that, for example, with all species of mammal. That's 4 times more species of bees than there are mammals on the planet. And they come from the huge to the very tiny. So this picture here shows the biggest bee in the world, this Megachile Pluto. It's a very large Indonesian resin bee, known as Wallace's giant bee. And the females can be a massive 38 millimeters big. Now that's pretty big when you think of a bee. So these are the world's biggest bees, and the world's smallest bees are very, very tiny, so less than 2 millimeters. So on the right-hand side of the slide here, you can see a couple of these tiny species of what are known as stingless bees. One is a mining bee, and the other one is a trigona, a stingless bee from Central America. And this huge diversity of bees means we have lots of different shapes, sizes and lifestyles, but one thing that all bees have in common is that they feed on nectar and pollen. And it's the pollen that they feed to their larvae that distinguishes them from their wasp ancestors. So wasps hunt for prey for their larvae to feed on, but bees feed their larvae pollen. So we can think of bees as basically vegetarian wasps. And you can see in these pictures here, these different bees. On the top left-hand corner there, you've got a picture of a bee that has this long proboscis, this long tongue, which enables it to reach deep into the flower to extract nectar. And you can see the bottom pictures on the left there, we've got a bumblebee with the big pollen carried in these pollen sacs. But in the middle at the bottom there, we've got a leafcutter bee that actually just packs the pollen on the underside of its abdomen. So you can see the yellow pollen at the bottom of the abdomen there. And then on the right-hand side, those 2 pictures there, on the top right-hand side, we have the pollen and nectar or honey stores of a honeybee. And you can see honeybees store their provisions in these neat little hexagonal cells in the hive. So the different coloured cells that you can see there are filled with different kinds of pollen. In the bottom right-hand corner of the slide there, what we see are actually the cells of a solitary bee, where she has collected pollen and she's made these little cells in which she stores the pollen and lays her eggs. So that's one thing that all bees have in common, is that they feed on nectar and pollen. And the other thing that most people don't realize about bees is that most of them are solitary. That means that they don't live in hives, and they have this life cycle where they mature or they grow up in basically solitary confinement. So that's why we think of them as solitary bees. So if you look at the life cycle of a solitary bee, we start with the adult in the middle picture at the top of the cycle there. She'll forage for nectar and pollen. Nectar gives her energy, pollen gives her the protein for her larvae. And what she does is she creates a nest, which is a single cell into which she deposits the pollen, and then she lays her egg. That egg hatches, feeds on the pollen as a larva, grows, and eventually pupates and emerges as an adult and starts the cycle again. But that larva develops on its own, so it's solitary. So a solitary bee might construct lots of cells next to each other, but each larva develops on its own. And only about 5% of species are social. So these are the more familiar lifestyles of bees. This means they have a queen who reproduces, she lays eggs. Those eggs, if they're fertilized, become females. But they don't lay their own eggs. They act as workers and help their mother, the queen, to rear more offspring. So the workers, they go out, they forage. She produces quite a lot of workers until at some point in the colony cycle, she starts producing males and new queens. And so those males and new queens leave the nest and go and do what they need to do. And the colony cycle can start again. And it's this division of labour with non-producing individuals, so there's workers that don't reproduce, the cooperative brood care amongst those workers helping to rear their siblings, and this overlapping of generations in a single nest, which defines these as social insects and social interactions. If we think about Ireland's bees, so we have 99 species of bee on the island of Ireland, 1 species of honeybee, 21 species of bumblebee. So these are our social bees that have a queen and this colony structure that I was just talking about. But most of our species are solitary. So 77 of our 99 species are solitary. And 62 of those nest in the ground, and only a small number, so only 15 of those nest in cavities. So when you think about bee hotels and trying to attract bees into your garden, it's only a very small proportion of the Irish fauna that would actually nest in those cavities, the bee hotels. Most of them nest in the ground. So if we ask people why does it matter, why are bees important? Many people will say because bees produce honey. But in this part of the world, it's only the honeybee, just that one species, that produces commercially extractable honey. In other parts of the world, there are other bee species that produce honey. For example, in that picture on the top right-hand corner there is so-called stingless bee honey. I mentioned stingless bees before. All female bees can sting. Some of these stingless bees are so tiny that the sting doesn't penetrate the flesh of a human. So therefore, we think of them as stingless. The other reason that bees are really important is not just because some species produce honey, but because of their role in pollination. And pollination involves the movement of pollen from the male structures of one flower to the female structures. And this because it's really important because flowers can't move to find a mate. So bees and other insects have become unwitting bearers of pollen and important pollinators. So as the bees forage for nectar, for pollen to feed their offspring, they get pollen on their bodies, on their feet, on their heads and their mouth parts. And as they move to the next flower to collect more pollen and nectar, that pollen gets deposited on the female reproductive structure of the flower. So this is a really important process for many, many plants. And one reason that bees and other pollinators are really important is because a lot of our food comes from animal pollinated crops. So 75% of the world's leading food crop species for humans are animal pollinated. So it's very important in terms of providing food for us. This has obviously an economic consequence. So for example, in Ireland, Irish food crops benefit from insect pollinators up to around about 60 million euro per year. And the cost of global pollinator loss to the Irish economy would be much, much higher. And this is because we import a lot of insect pollinated crops. We don't grow an awful lot of insect pollinated crops ourselves. So apples, tomatoes, peppers, strawberries, really important crops that we produce here in Ireland, but we import a huge variety and a huge amount of insect and other animal pollinated food from elsewhere. So the cost, when we talk about the cost of the loss of pollinators to the Irish economy, it's not just the cost of loss of our own home produced crops, but also this loss that occurs elsewhere has an impact, an economic impact in Ireland. And animal pollination doesn't just mean the difference between producing fruit or not in crops, it's also important for the quality of crop yields. So for example, here we have on the left-hand side there, you can see a little solitary bee foraging on a strawberry flower. And on the right-hand side, we've got 3 strawberries that are the result of different kinds of pollination. So the one on the left is one kind of normal, delicious looking full strawberry fruit that's a result of bee pollination. In the middle, there's a fruit formed when there's no bees and the flower self-pollinates, but it's not a commercially marketable fruit. And on the right-hand side there, we've got a fruit that's formed through a bit of wind pollination. And you can see there's that kind of dink in the side of the fruit there. The fruit isn't fully formed. And often these crevices and these malformations in the fruit can trap fungal pathogens and the fruit can go moldy more quickly. So the insect pollinated fruit here, so the strawberry can still produce the fruit. So if we talk about the quantity of yield, we say, yeah, the strawberries produced, this strawberry flowers produced a fruit even in the absence of insects, but that fruit isn't of very high quality. And so there's been research that has looked at strawberry pollination, for example, and found that bee pollinated fruits have a better shelf life, they have a greater nutritional quality, and of course, then they command a greater economic income. But crop pollination obviously is important beyond just the monetary value of crops. As the human population on this planet increases to 9 billion over the next 30 years or so, we're going to need more food globally. Now, whereas staple carbohydrates, things like rice, wheat and maize don't need animal pollination, it's expected that there'll be more of a shift in diet to a more varied diet and more meat consumption. And this means that more fodder needs to be produced. And many livestock fodders are animal pollinated. So for example, in North America, alfalfa is an important animal pollinated livestock fodder. We also need to have healthy diets. So it's important that we're not just eating rice and maize and wheat, but we have diversity of vitamins and minerals in our diets. And very often they are produced or provided for by insect or other animal pollinated products. So for example, half of all the plant-derived sources of vitamin A worldwide require animal pollination. And it's been estimated that a loss of pollinators can have this knock-on impact on vitamin A intake, and changes in diets associated with this can actually contribute towards global deaths. So obviously, pollination is important in terms of our health and well-being. And also people like choice. So in this part of the world, we're affluent, we can afford to choose what we want to eat. So even if we don't produce many animal dependent crops here in Ireland, as I said, we import plenty of them year round. These contribute to our healthy diets and give us choice when we are doing our food shopping. And it's not just healthy diets, but our luxury products as well are animal pollinated. So for example, coffee and chocolate and products using cosmetics are animal pollinated. So this flower that I've just popped up on the screen there is the shea flower, and it produces these shea fruits, which are used to make shea butter, and shea butter is used in a lot of confectionery and cosmetics. So it's not all about necessity, it's not all about putting food on the table, but it's also about improving our lifestyle choices. And pollination can be important beyond us, beyond people. It can be important in the ecosystem. So for example, if we look at these rolling green hills shown in the picture here, a lot of those plants, the woody plants, the marginal and grassland plants, would be animal pollinated. And so pollination contributes to this diversity in the wider ecosystem and all the things that ecosystem does. So, for example, in terms of providing fruit and seeds for farmland birds and other animals, in terms of maintaining those plant communities so that they can continue to sequester carbon and continue to produce oxygen, and in terms of some of those plants actually influencing nutrient cycles in the soil. So these nitrogen fixing legumes are animal pollinated as well. So pollinators are important in this broader sense as well, beyond just providing stuff for people. They're important through our ecosystems. So when we talk about the importance of pollination services and the value of pollination services, yes, they're really important in our diets because 75% of world crop species are animal pollinated. But possibly even more importantly, nearly 90% of all flowering plant species on this planet are animal pollinated. So they have huge importance in the wider ecosystem and in the other benefits that we get from those ecosystems. So the point is, it's not just about crops. Obviously, pollinators are important for crop production, for market outputs, but also for non-marketed outputs and products as well. So we think about if we go wild foraging for berries in the hedgerows, many of those are as a result of insect pollination. There's no market for them, but we do get a benefit from them. Pollinators also have this important ecological function that I've mentioned, but also in terms of future potential, as climates change, as diets choices change, we might change the kinds of crops that we grow. We may have different climates. We may be prioritizing different species. So protecting and serving pollinators gives us this future potential. There's also this satisfaction from the knowledge of the existence of lots of different species of pollinators. And you think about those 20,000 species of bee, you know, I'm never going to see all those species in my lifetime, but there is satisfaction from knowing there's 20,000 species of bee out there, from these great big resin bees, Wallace's bees, all the way down to these tiny little bees smaller than a match head. And also, pollinators and bees may have benefits for future generations. And so there's a sort of a moral obligation to conserve and look after pollinators. But the problem is our bees are in decline. So of our 99 species that we have here in Ireland, a third of them are threatened with extinction. So when we look at the populations of these bees, we know that more than half of their populations have declined, and a third of the species are actually at risk of extinction. When we look a bit further afield and we look into Europe, across Europe, there are about 2,000 species of bee, and about 9% of those species are thought to be threatened with extinction. Now you might think, okay, what's the problem in Ireland? Why are 30% of our species threatened with extinction when only 9% in the rest of Europe? One of the problems is actually a lack of information. We don't have data on more than half of the bee species across Europe. And this is one reason that only 9% of those bees assessed are thought to be threatened with extinction. Is in all likelihood, if we knew more about them, we'd probably know that more species were at risk. Across Europe, a quarter of bumblebee species are threatened with extinction. And this is just a quote from this report here, this European Red List of bees, that 46%, so nearly half of bumblebee species in Europe, have declining populations, but a third, nearly a third, 29% of bumblebee populations are stable, and 13% are actually increasing. And this is an important point as well. So we don't know a lot about a lot of our species of bee. For those species that we do know a lot about, like the bumblebees, yes, lots of them are in decline, but actually some of them are doing okay, and some of them are actually increasing their range. So when we talk about decline, it's not all species that are in decline, and we don't know an awful lot about a lot of species and their decline. Now, one species that is not in decline is the honeybee. So when we see a lot of these Save the Bee campaigns and a lot of action for managed honeybees, Apis mellifera, that's actually directing resources in the wrong direction. So if we look at this graph here is from some data from the FAO website, so that's the UN Food and Agricultural Organization, and we look at the number of honeybee hives across the world from the 1960s until 2019. 2019 when I downloaded these data, and you can see there's a steady increase in the total number of hives across the world. And even if we look at it, the orange line there, the EU, we can see we don't have a decline. So when we're talking about decline in bees, it's not the managed honeybee that we're talking about being in decline. Yes, it does have some problems. It has some health issues and some management issues that need to be dealt with, certainly, but it's not as a species in decline. So what is causing the decline of these different bee species? Well, it's thought that a range of multiple stressors are driving decline. So a combination of all of these different things, so loss of habitat, so loss of places to nest, loss of places to feed, the use of agrochemicals and pesticides, climate change, emergent diseases and parasites, invasive species, and consequences of management and trade. All of these things are acting together to drive the decline in bees and other pollinators. And actually, probably these are the same stresses that are driving biodiversity decline in general. So if we think about agricultural intensification, and we think about how that affects bees, what do bees need in our countryside, in the landscape? They need floral resources, they need nesting substrates and nesting resources, they need places to mate, they need places to overwinter, they need the right kinds of microclimates and climatic conditions. And so this can be affected by agricultural management and intensification of agriculture at a local scale. So in terms of which crops are grown, how those crops are managed, what the margins of those crops look like, what the inputs to those crops are. But because bees fly in general, beyond a single field, they're not just affected by what's going on in a single field, but what's going on at the landscape scale. So certainly some of those social bee species can fly a long distance, up to several kilometers. So they're affected not just by what's going on in a single field, but what's going on in those surrounding fields as well. So what's in those fields, so the composition of those landscapes, and how those fields are put together and what other kind of habitat features are there. So that's the configuration of the landscape. So for example, in Ireland, if we look at this landscape scale and look at how landscape composition and configuration affects pollinator abundance and diversity, we did some surveys of semi-natural grasslands across the Midlands, in Roscommon and Offaly, and we found that a loss of semi-natural grasslands in the landscape was associated with fewer solitary bees and fewer hoverflies. So we're seeing, as we lose these semi-natural grassland habitat types across the landscape, we reduce the number of these insects. And then it's not just about what kinds of habitats are in the landscape, but also again about this composition of the landscape. So the shapes and the sizes of the patches in the landscape and how they are configured together. And what we find is that when we lose landscape composition, so we lose this complexity of composition, then we see a decline in butterflies and in hoverflies. So the way that we're managing agricultural land, the countryside, can influence or can contribute to the decline of pollinators. Now, the other thing, obviously, that's been very high profile in terms of bee decline is the impacts of pesticides. And of course, insecticides, so these are chemicals that are designed specifically to kill insects, can have effects on bees because they are insects. So insecticides can have both lethal impacts, that is, they can kill bees, but also sublethal effects, so they can affect their behavior and their ability to forage, to find their way home, etc. So we shouldn't be surprised at the fact insecticides affect insects. It's what they were designed for. But other pesticides like herbicides and fungicides can also have impacts on bees. So herbicides can remove the food source that bees need, can have impacts on soils, and can also affect bees in terms of their behavior, their navigational skills, and their gut bacteria, so their health. And fungicides similarly can have impacts on the gut microbiome in bees and their respiration. So pesticides and pesticide use can have impacts on pollinator decline. And there's evidence from other parts of Europe that these pesticides are really quite prevalent in the landscape. So we find residues of pesticides in soils. So this study showed more than 80% of soils that were tested contained pesticide residues. And you probably can't see all the details on this, but basically what it was a study looking at lots of small streams across Europe, and found that 100% of those streams were contaminated with pesticides. Now, we don't have data from Ireland in these papers, and so this is a sort of a knowledge gap in Ireland, is how prevalent pesticide residues are in Ireland. In terms of the impacts on bees, you can get residues of pesticides in the nectar and pollen of both flowering crops that bees visit, like oilseed rape and maize. Even though maize is wind pollinated, bees will visit to collect the pollen. And you can also end up with residues of pesticide in the wildflowers growing at the margins of our agricultural fields. And also some plants supplied to garden centres can be contaminated with pesticides that have been used in the horticultural rearing of the plants. Again, we don't know exactly what the situation is in Ireland yet. But we do know that pesticides are showing up in honey. So this was a global study that showed that neonicotinoids, a particular class of pesticides, were found in 75% of honeys that were sampled from around the globe. Again, there were no Irish samples in that study, so we did our own study. And Sola Kavanagh did some work with myself and with Blonde and White at DCU, and found neonicotinoids in 77% of honey samples from 30 sites across Ireland. So very similar levels of prevalence to the global study. So we know that the pesticides are probably out there, and that bees, at least honeybees anyway, are being exposed to them. So we really need to understand a bit more about this relationship between bees and pesticides, and to try and reduce our pesticide use and be more sustainable in our use of pesticides if they're needed at all. So to conclude then, what's the buzz about bees? It's not all about honeybees. There's lots of different bees on the planet. They're really important pollinators, but they're not just important pollinators of crops, they're important pollinators of wild plants as well. And it's a range of threats and pressures that are causing decline. I've just mentioned today things about habitat change and habitat loss and the landscapes and pesticides, but there are these other issues as well which are contributing to pollinator decline. If you want to do something about this, if you want to take action and do something to help pollinators, then the All Ireland Pollinator Plan, on the logo there, it says 2015 to 2020. In 2021, we launched phase 2 of the All Ireland Pollinator Plan. And if you visit www.pollinators.ie, there's loads of information and advice and guidelines about what you can do to help. So I'll just finish up there and say, if you want to find out more about our research, we have a blog, or you can follow me on Twitter or contact me there by my email address. And just to highlight, oh, I lost a couple of people there. A lot of the hard work that's being done by my research team at Trinity. So I have lots of people currently, the guys all on the top row there are all working on pollinators. Alina, Eleanor and Lindsay all working on a project looking at modelling pesticide risks in Ireland, looking at residues. You know, I said there was a gap in the research there, and looking at impacts particularly on bumblebees. Irena and Jordan are part of a big EU project where we're looking at multiple stressors on managed bees in particular. Sarah's looking at commercial bumblebees. Kerry's looking at encouraging pollinators on farms and in factory sites. She's working with KEPAC. And Latif is a PhD student who is working in West Africa, doing some more work on the shear pollination system. And then across the bottom row there, lots of other work going on in my research group at the moment in terms of biodiversity loss, in terms of how we can conserve biodiversity and what approaches we can take to mainstream biodiversity and make sure that our conservation and restoration of biodiversity is both ecologically sound as well as economically viable and socially just. So thanks very much for your attention. Bye-bye.